Welcome, everybody, to the UC Davis Library. My name is Mackenzie Smith, and I'm the head librarian here and your host for the evening. We're delighted to have such a great turnout for this event, and your response really underscores just how lucky we are to have this fantastic group of speakers here tonight. The library is also very fortunate to have Hugh Johnson and Bob Thompson's papers in our special collections, the beginning, the genesis of this event, and others in the future, we hope. So I'd like to thank them both again personally for the gift of their collections. It's a great privilege for UC Davis to be helping steward your legacy. The manuscripts, photographs, notes, and many other keepsakes from your collections will shed new light on the story of wine and the people and places that made California wine among the best in the world. And Warren, we're so grateful for your continued support as we work to create the greatest wine library in the world and greatest collection on wine writing. In fact, in describing why wine writers are so important in shaping the wine industry, you really put it best by saying that winemakers needed a vocabulary to convey the taste, smell, and structural elements of wine in words, and wine writers provided those words. So thank you for sharing our vision of preserving the work of these seminal wine writers who played such an important role in the history of wine. Before we begin tonight's main event, we've invited UC Davis's very own professor of enology, Roger Bolton, to offer some remarks on the impact of the recent wildfires in the Northern California wine country, which I know have been on all of our minds over the last month. Dr. Bolton is the Stephen Sinclair Scott Endowed Chair in Enology here at UC Davis, and a respected researcher, teacher, and advisor to wineries around the world. He's an award-winning author for The Principles and Practices of Winemaking, which was a collaboration with several equally renowned colleagues in the wine department here. And in 2000, he was named one of the 50 most influential people in the US wine industry by Wines and Vines magazine. Roger, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts about the fires and what they mean for winemaking in this region. Could I have you come up, please?
So thank you, Mackenzie. Just a few quick comments. You're well aware of the impact socially, economically, personally. I don't want to try to convey those points. I just want to try to address the issue of what people refer to as smoke taint, because like many things, it seems information flows very quickly. Knowledge and understanding are often well behind, and actual facts, well, we'll get those later. The point is, so when we have a fire like this, and they've had them around the world in various countries, in Portugal, in Spain, Australia, Argentina, there is chemistry in the smoke itself. And some of that chemistry attaches and undergoes modification in berries, okay? And some of that is able to be retained in fermentation and persist in the finished wines, okay? All of that's true. Some of those compounds disappear because they get turned into forms that you can't smell, but they're there. So they're the below the water iceberg piece, not the iceberg that's sticking up. These come out later in aging and hydrolysis, potentially. So that's the reality as we understand it. We understand most of those compounds. So there are marker compounds people go chasing. And the marker compounds are terrific, except that some of them are in toasted barrels. So now, is it coming from smoke taint or is it from toasted barrels? Some of them aren't. But even the 5 most common molecules that people recognise in smoke, if you measure them and put them together, you can't predict how people perceive smoke very well. So they're markers, but they're not good predictors, okay? And the other ones that haven't been hydrolyzed yet don't show up, okay? So that's the dark end of the picture, but that's the reality. In these fires, there's 2 things that are incredibly fortunate for everybody. The first is probably 90% of the fruit was already harvested. There are many cultivars which were already picked and fermented long before the smoke occurred. And so I think, depending on the area you're in, maybe 10%, maybe even less, of the grapes available would have even been exposed to smoke, okay? Then the question is how long and how dense, how much, is it trapped or is it free? And until fermentations are finished and people have pressed off, until we run analyses that aren't just the volatiles, we won't really know. So the point, I think, is we don't know. And I think there's something very healthy about saying there's times when we need to say we don't know. We'll go and find out, but the perception that this harvest is ruined because of smoke taint, please show the exit to the person who's the alarmist, and I welcome their opinion, but we might want to get the reality. So a lot of wineries are looking, waiting, keeping, kept, let separate. They will analyse, they will find out, but it's not going to be because there was fires that suddenly this is a bad vintage or this is terrible. It'll be case by case, and it'll be which block and do you actually want to bring that to market? And so I hope that gives you some perspective of what otherwise would seem like a disaster from a wine quality perspective. I think all of us would agree that in the context of the human piece is actually minor. Most of us know people who've lost homes and kids who can't go to school and can't go to hospital, all of the things that we take for granted. So it's not just the fire and the smoke. Please understand the human penalty. So I hope that's been good. I don't want to put a damper on it. It's such an incredible evening. Let's get on with the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was somewhat reassuring. And I also think it was important for us to acknowledge what's happened in the last month and that, this is a celebratory event, but we are dealing with the aftermath of the fires, and I hope you'll all join me in trying to help our colleagues in that part of the state. Before we begin tonight's main event, sorry, we already did that. Moving on, now we turn to the heart of tonight's program, the panel discussion on the emergence of Northern California, or a modern California wine. Of course, part of the reason that the fires were followed so closely by so many people all over the world is because Napa and Sonoma are so significant in the global wine industry. Tonight's panel is going to explore how the California wine country became the global powerhouse that it is today, among the other topics of interest to them. So to begin, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Narsai David. You'll have lots of opportunities to welcome him. Narsai is well known to all of us as the food and wine editor for KCBS Radio in San Francisco, and he's made the trek out here to Davis to visit with his old friends. In addition to his work in radio and television, he's an author, a wine judge, and a former restaurateur. He's also been growing grapes himself in the Napa Valley for over 40 years and has even produced his own Cabernet Sauvignon. So Narsai, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I'm going to hand things over to you now.
Mackenzie, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's my privilege to introduce our speakers. Hugh Johnson joins us from London, where he's been writing about wine for more than 50 years. He's widely recognized as one of the world's most influential and respected wine writers. He's the author of more than a half dozen books, including the groundbreaking World Atlas of Wine, which was first published in 1971. Hugh Johnson. Bob Thompson is widely regarded as one of the preeminent writers on the subject of California and West Coast wines. He's written several books on the California wine region, as well as the California Wine Book, which he wrote together with Hugh Johnson, and the Book of California Wine, which he wrote with Doris Muscatine and Maynard Amarine. Bob. Warren Winiarski is the founder and former proprietor of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, probably best known for helping to put California wine on the global map by creating the first Cabernet to beat the French in a blind tasting in Paris done by French judges in 1976. A piece of history that you'll be hearing a lot more of this evening. Warren. I'd like to thank Dr. Bolton for his comments on the wildfires that have done so much damage. The fire obviously didn't destroy many vineyards, but that smoke taint is a problem that it's going to take some years to settle, and we just hope that it settles out. A key reason that these wildfires are so significant is that they impact the region that is so important to the global wine industry, economically, culturally, historically. The significance of the Napa Valley in particular dates back to 1976, when that blind tasting took place, now known as the Judgment of Paris. For those that aren't familiar with the story of the Paris tasting, 2 Napa wines, a Chateau Montelena Chardonnay made by Mike Gergich, and a Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet Sauvignon made by Warren Winiarski, were selected as the winning wines by a panel of French judges, beating a field that included some of the finest wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux. It was a pivotal moment in the emergence of modern California wine because it was the first time that fine wines from anywhere else in the world were able to compete successfully with the wines made in France. The event was so historic that a bottle of each of the winning wines was among the Smithsonian Institution's 101 objects that made America. And Robert Mondavi said so clearly, it put us squarely on the world map of great wine-producing regions. Now, I'd like to back up from that Paris judging and talk about what led up to that point in the California wine industry. What was going on surrounding California wine that created the opportunity for that kind of success? In the early 60s, there were, I like to think of 4 main Napa wineries. There were actually about 25 all told, I think, in those days. Louis Martini, Beaulieu, Engelnook, and Charles Krug were sort of in a group by themselves. Jack and Jamie Davies bought Schramsberg in 1965. Robert Mondavi built his new winery in 1966. Katie and Gene Trefethen bought about 600 acres in 1968. And new technologies in winemaking started to be introduced. So I'd like to go through some of that with all of you. Warren, let's start with you. What about barrels? How does that fit into the situation? And how does that fit into what new things were going on dating back to the 60s and 70s?
Mm-hmm. Well, barrels, and particularly French oak barrels, were being used, were beginning to be used rather universally. It was a growing need for people to use French oak barrels. And that actually started by Ambassador Zellerbach at Helmsell in the 50s. He was the first, actually he was the first to believe that he could make wines similar to the wines of Burgundy. He had this as a very dedicated notion that, and he wanted everything to be similar. So he got French barrels and used them in a way that he thought the French would have used them.
And what about any other thing happening?
Well, after the
technology?
Mondavi on a commercial scale, Robert Mondavi in 66 brought in French barrels for the first time on a commercial scale. And that was kind of the beginning for a flood of French barrels that were used universally. Other things were happening also at the same time, and I don't know if you want to go on with the other things that might...
There are a couple of technological things that were happening.
The big thing was people. Andrei Chelistchev, for example, contributing his significant knowledge and poetic feeling about wine that made a huge difference. He was a man who combined both the rigors of science and the flights of poetry. And people were talking about wine, began to be talking about wine in poetic terms, in terms that exceeded the commercial and bulk wine mentality that existed before. That all changed. That began to have a flow and a rapidity of change of orientation. What were you looking to do with your wines? That notion drove many decisions about winemaking.
Bob, what would you like to add to the ideas at that point?
For me, the real point is there began to be numbers. You mentioned the big four. No news is no news. Those guys were the extent of, for lack of a better word, collectibles. And If you look at Paris, the proximity of the founding dates of the wineries to the event is pretty striking. Freemark Abbey was rebuilt in 67. Mayacamas was bought anew in 68. Heights started in 64, really in 65. Clos first vintage was 72. Warren's first vintage was 72. This suddenly opened an avenue to think some really complex thoughts.
Hugh, what about the view from the other side of the pond, as it were? What were people writing about California wine in those days?
Well, Narsai, the reason I have a book open on my lap is because I suddenly realized...
How come it's got all those cross marks scribbled across it?
That was just cutting out the rubbish.
Okay.
No, I have here a prehistoric view, which is, I'm going to, if you'll permit me, I'm going to read from my own book, which was published 10 years before the famous Paris tasting. This is 1966. It's right in the middle of the period that Bob is talking about. And by the way,
Same time as Mondavi, 66.
That's the year he started.
Yeah. And one eminent name not recorded here was Don Chapelet. Started his winery in 1967, making one of the most remarkable modern buildings to this day in California, but apart from wonderful wine. But let me just read you, if I may. This is a prehistoric point of view. This is from the other side of the pond and all that. It's sometimes hard to believe, as you see the strange juxtaposition of vineyards and cattle ranches, of bare grass hills, the west of Horse Opera, with Pinot Noir and Pinot Chardonnay, the delicate grapes of Champagne, that anything but a rough and ready drink for cowboys can come of it. Yet of all the places which have ever set out to imitate the great wines of France, only California has ever succeeded. I'm not using the word great loosely. There are a handful of winemakers in the Napa and Sonoma valleys who have demonstrated that what they can make is comparable with a Chevalier Montrachet or a Chateau Latour, not just a vague white Burgundy or Bordeaux. They are, of course, very much in a minority, as the great winemakers are in France. But it has been proved, beyond question, that certain areas of California have the potential. It only remains to be seen what commerce will make of it. So that is 10 years in advance of seeing what actually happened when it came to the crunch in Paris. And a little bit of autobiography here. I first met California wine when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University in 1956, so 10 years before that. And I first came to California in 1957, and I may be able to proudly say to people in San Francisco, I've been here for 60 years, and I feel quite but so that is on record here. And then when I met Bob, and that happened because he worked for Wine Institute, and I was lucky enough, I was looking for a guide, show me around the vineyards, and they drafted Bob to show me around. And then a friendship ripened into a collaboration, and we wrote a book together, which came out in 1975, and that was the first of its kind, really, where the point was to identify the winemakers making really, really fine wine and with a right spirit, which Warren has described so well. The book, alas, is not on everybody's shelves because there was an accident with the publisher. I won't go into the detail, but it was not widely circulated, but it existed. And so there you have a sort of encapsulated 1966 to 1975 run up to what happened in Paris.
Excellent, thank you. About this time, we started hearing about vineyards by name, not just the names of wineries, but names of individual vineyards. Heights, Martha's Vineyard, was distinguished from all of the other grapes that he had available. Al Bronstein up on Diamond Creek on Diamond Mountain had 3 vineyards, Red Rock Terrace, Gravelly Meadow, Volcanic Hill, all 3 of them on a single 20-acre parcel of land. I've often thought to myself, if I had ever had anything to do with that, I'd like to have blended some of those. And, but meanwhile, that's an aside. Each of them was identified individually, brought a premium price in the market. How does the press look back on those days as the beginning of vineyard designated, and how important do you see it as? Anybody could kick in to start. Bob? Are you anybody?
I'm trying to shrink here. The endless charm of wine is complexity, and that comes from the bottle to the consumer, but also goes from the consumer back to the bottle. People love to have things to think about, and I think probably as much as it's developed in California so far, that's its principal virtue. There isn't enough of it in the state to start making great generalizations about boundaries here and boundaries there, but it certainly has identified some wines that you really do want to think about. The best of them are truly memorable. Warren's Stag's Leap Vineyard, just for one example, is pretty easy to distinguish from basic Stag's Leap, and
Right.
also from his neighbors north and south. So,
Warren, could you like that, say that?
Yeah, I like that image. Take your face when you look in the mirror tonight and draw a line down the center, and you'll see that both sides of your face are different. Do you like them equally well? Do you talk to them differently? And I like to use the Hugh's example of wines that talk to you. In other words, they are like human beings talking. And they have a different message. And they speak a different tone. And they speak in a different modulation. And they speak with this kind of subtlety and that kind of subtlety, and they're different. And if you want to express that difference, if you think there's something not only interesting, but worthy to talk to, you want to express that. If you see that poetic difference between one thing and another, one side of your face and another, and you love them both, then you want to get that in the bottle. And no winemaker who is worth his salt will make something that he doesn't try to control with his intention. He tries to express the subtleties he sees in that wine. And so if he finds those subtleties in even small differences in the vineyard, he will try to. I understand there's some wine now that's called 100 vines. It's getting so small.
Marketing, marketing, marketing. Well, let's
do with it.
look at the French situation, Hugh, if you will. With the Napoleonic Code, there are vineyards that have gotten chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces, so that there are indeed vineyards that have just a few rows and make incredibly world-famous wines.
Indeed there are. I think the Burgundy is the outstanding
Prime example.
or the prime example, because the vineyard names of Burgundy need a lot of understanding and a lot of explaining. The vineyard, the parcel, is known as a climat, and a climat is a word that is very, very hard to translate. It has to be explained. These are plots of land which have been distinguished over a very, very long time in most cases, and they must have distinguished themselves, because you'll have one hill which is the village of Jouligny-Montrachet, or it could be Chambord-Musigny, and within it there are parcels that have not been delineated by ownership at all. Their names have existed. Very often their names come from the nature of the soil. If it's a stony soil, it might be have a name relating to that. Or they describe the parcel, and that parcel can be broken up among many different owners. Very often is due to Napoleonic Code. There is an identity. Some of the interpretations of it will be much better than others, but there is an identity belonging to that land. I was involved in a committee in Burgundy 3 or 4 years ago as a submission to UNESCO to have World Heritage Site status granted to the climat of the Côte d'Or. Not the cellars, not the grapes, not the winemakers, not the monuments, but this strange animal which is a climat. And the UNESCO looked at it and they said, yes, there's nothing else like it. It's perfectly true. History has given Burgundy this system which it treasures, obviously, and out of which it makes a fortune. But it wasn't invented for Burgundy. It came out of the land.
What about the word terroir? How does that relate to climat?
Well, terroir is a wonderful word to play with because you can talk about it in terms of soil, in terms of microclimates, in terms of mini climates, and this corner of a wall keeps the wind off these few vines, and the wine grower will be aware of that, and he'll take advantage of it if he can. But also the whole culture. What is the maker, what is the lucky owner of Volnay-Centenot trying to make? He's trying to make a wine that is like a Volnay-Centenot, which can't be defined, but it's because this concept of the soil and everything that happens on it is terroir. Now, climat is the manifestation of that in a strangely permanent fashion, as I say, over stretches of land. And it's human experience.
Bob, you have a puzzled look on your face.
No, I don't.
I thought you were waiting with a comment to add there.
No, I just
Yeah,
listening and learning.
All right. So somewhere along the way, wines started to be rated on a score system. Now, so many years ago, Maynard Amoryne taught a course at Berkeley and the following year in San Francisco as a wine introduction course. I took that class. I'm fond of saying that I took that class and I did so poorly that the next year I had to take it over again. But we learned a 20-point scale that was developed here at Davis mainly as a teaching tool. And it was fascinating how a crowd of us could sit there and within just less than an hour or two be rating the wines and coming up with pretty close to the same score because he differentiated between the varietal characteristics and how well the wine was made, how it was balanced. It was a neat kind of a reference point. But then comes along this 100-point scale where wines are graded, and it's like you get an A+, or do you get an A-, or do you get a passing grade? And it just seems to me that really changed things dramatically around the world. There are stories of French winemakers redoing their wines in order to satisfy a particular reviewer who would be more likely to give them 94 points. What about the point system? What kind of an impact do you feel, Bob, that's had on
Bah and humbug.
Bah and humbug.
Maynard's 20-point scale had virtue. It was a way to impose discipline on the taster.
Right.
You had to pay attention to the parts. Any damn fool who can count to 100 can award 100 points if there's no internal discipline. I spent a lot of years on the judging circuit. You did. For my sins, I was stuck with Chardonnay for years. And so I would hit situations where I would judge the same wine 7 times in a year. And I thought I was terrific, and I paid attention to a lot of the other judges, and some of them were damn good too. We would give a wine over the span of a judging season, medals ranging from gold to bronze.
For the same wine.
For the same wine. That means we were giving them 100-point scores ranging from 97 down to about 82. I have never seen anybody on the face of the earth who could give an intellectually honest score within 100. You just can't do it. The wine changes, you change. It's 96 in Riverside, and it's 56 in Boonville, and the sun's out or it's raining like hell, and you're hungry.
The time of day, or how
not.
hungry you are, or whether you've just eaten or
All
not.
of that. So
You're getting on very dangerous ground when you're scoring wines, thinking of the 1976 tasting.
That was before the 100-point system, though.
They didn't have the 100-point
they
system
did
on that
not
one.
have a 100-point, nor a collection of rookies using it. Right? Everybody who now is around the game at all uses the 100-point scale. Anybody can understand it. 97 is better than 96. And so it's very seductive. It probably, because it's so seductive, has really made a big change in wine sales. But I'm now going to blow up the whole conference.
Did it change wine style, do you believe?
Yeah, we're going to, definitely. But I think in a certain sense, it is a symptom and not a cause of the fact that the Paris tasting of 76 was a culmination and not a beginning. 76 said to the world that California could make wine that would confuse a Frenchman as to its origins. And the next thing that happened was we started making wine that nobody would confuse with anywhere else.
But it can't be coincidence that the 100-point system broke on the world in 1978. Because I remember I had an editor in New York.
Excuse me, you said in what year?
78.
In 78.
My New York editor passed me a manuscript and said, "What do you think of this? This is a new wine writer." And I read these wonderfully vivid, enthusiastic, over-the-top tasting notes, using words that I would have thought slightly hyperbolical in some cases. And then there was the vintage in the margin, and then there was a number, 89, 91 or something. I said, "Dan, okay, I think this chap has got real talent, he's terrific. Such an enthusiast, but what are the numbers? They're the scores." And I said, "Scores? I mean, what else can you score? Would you like to score your friends?" I still don't understand it. Somebody asked me whether a wine was a 90-pointer or an 89-pointer or even an 80. I say, make up your own mind. I can't tell you.
Warren, from the viewpoint of a producer.
Yeah, and I'll get your comments also, if I could, from a viewpoint of a restaurateur. It's a simplification. It's a reduction. It's an attempt to put some kind of consumer assistance in place for evaluation. But as all of you know, you don't do that about your friends. You don't try to reduce their complexity to some simple numerical scheme. But as Bob pointed out, it did help California wines in a systematic way in the beginning. It also helped them to get marks that were higher possibly than they deserve, because you got 2 points in that 20-point scale just for not being acetic, being not vinegar. So it's not a very, amplifying, it's not a very encouraging methodology. And you can't reduce everything to that. I believe Bob and Hugh have not scored wines. They are among the few who have not used that methodology because they don't believe that the complexity of wine can be reduced by simplifying ways of judging it. It's more important to talk about it as Hugh does and Bob, what's good for food, what it's like in terms of human terms. And it's a method, those are two methods which are not simple, and they require some effort on your part to try to understand. And so that simplification is also a loss.
Your comment about being good for food really leads me into the next aspect of this, which is that it seems that the higher the score was, the higher the alcohol was as well. And I had the toughest struggle, and continue to this day, trying to figure out how to correlate wine with food. And it seems like suddenly wine was being made more to be used as a cocktail than a wine to complement food. In my experience, if you try to age one a few years to see if it can mellow out and become more acceptable, it just falls apart, doesn't work. And yet, the higher that score is, inevitably the higher the alcohol seems to be.
Inevitably, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
No, there are different sort of qualities that stand out. But what the higher alcohol does is it hides the other wines in a tasting. If you have a lineup, I think of this when I drive through France, and I see, as I come to a railroad crossing, there's always a sign saying "Un train peut-on cacher un autre." Well, it's un vin peut-on cacher un autre. One train can hide another, one wine can hide another, and it's the stronger wine that hides the maybe the better wine.
For different reasons, better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan Berger's immortal line, he finished a competition one day and he said, "We tasted 59 Chardonnays this morning, all from the same bottle." Something has happened, and I said earlier that I think the 100-point Johnnies are a symptom and not a cause. Society has changed. In the vintages from the 50s and 60s, we, Narsai, to a lesser degree, Warren, we weren't quite here yet, a handful of doctors in San Francisco collected this handful of wines. Nobody wrote for them. There wasn't anybody to write. There wasn't, no news is news, no news. There were the 4 wines. They chose among those. They learned a lot about other wines. They were all doctors, which meant they were people who accumulated over a career their standing, their skill, not only professionally as medical men, but as social animals, collectors of wine, whatnot. They had a first house and maybe a second house, and then the house where the family grew up. There was this long period that you used wine, and so a cellar made sense. Come the 80s, really, and the first big wave of the dot-commies, wealth was suddenly a different thing. 20-year-old had already made $46 million and lost most of it, but he didn't care because he was going to make it again. People don't think of careers. They think of startups, new startups. They don't think of living in a place, and a cellar makes no sense to them. They want they're famous at this point, I think, for wanting instant gratification, and the kind of wines that really fit a 100-point scale-driven wine press fit their needs. You get the big bold. You take it to the party, you make a splash. Another way to look at it, in the 50s, you had a price range. You could get a vintage dated varietal for $1 and change, and the really uppity people charged $5.
Joe Hyde.
Yeah, gee whiz. Now look, you can get a bottle of vintage dated varietal for $2.50, or you can pay $500, $700. I hear $1,000. It's a whole different social thing going on, and wine is trying to fit it.
Well, I think it was a bad moment when wine could be described as luxury goods. If anyone here remembers Roy Brady,
Oh, yeah.
he was a bit of a cussed guy, but he had a lot of sense, and he wrote very well about wine. And I remember him saying, fine wine used to be for the worthy, now it's for the wealthy. And that was a big change.
It just is painful to think of that as a turning point. I recall some years ago, Darrell Cordia at the Cordia Brothers stores here in Sacramento told his employees to not accept any more wine samples that were over 14.5 alcohol. And the buzz got around the industry. Cordia Brothers is refusing high alcohol wines. And I don't know how long that buzz lasted, but I have the sense that there is really an attempt at tempering that, at bringing it back down, particularly among some of the newer young winemakers. What do you see happening, Warren, in the industry?
I do see that. I'm not doing marketing anymore, but I do see that the interest in food and the subtleties of food with the chefs who are devoted to that, they find those wines are inappropriate companions for their foods because they're so powerful that they obliterate. They act more as an erasure rather than a friend to the subtlety of the foods that they're trying to produce in these chefs. So they're not taking those high alcohol wines, which are based on a deliberate immoderation. The 73 Cabernet that did so well in Paris was 13%. And my goal was moderation. My goal was balance and completeness in the wine rather than anything that was meant to be so loud that you're hearing. If you compare tasting with hearing, the volume was so highly turned up that you were momentarily deafened. Your palate was momentarily deafened by the sheer volume of the alcohol and the other elements that were meant to be extracted to the highest degree possible. Rather than the right amount, you were talking about the higher amount or the highest potential amount.
Well, in California, historically, 12.5% was the mid-range, and a wine could be labeled table wine, and it would be anywhere between 11 and 14. We were allowed, or the ABC allowed, plus or minus 1.5 points until you got up to 14. At 14, you have a slightly higher tax level, and from that point up, it had to be plus or minus 1 point. But 12.5, 13 was really pretty much the standard. And now, when I see something labeled 14.9, I know damn well that it's closer to 16 than it is 15. It just seems inevitable. Well, what about the attitude among winemakers here in Napa after the judgment of Paris? And this comes directly to you, Warren. How did that impact the conversation and the feelings in the Napa Valley, what impact did that have on the way people made wine? Do you see?
Well, I think for a while there that they said, let's look at this wine. Let's think about this wine that did so well. And then other things intervened. So, and I think for a long time, we've gone the other way. But I take comfort in the fact that Gerald Asher said this beautiful thing: the pendulum that swings one way has yet to be invented.
But there is a point that puzzles me about the economics of making a wine, of which you can't drink more than a glass or two without getting drunk. Because surely the winemaker's goal is to get somebody to finish the bottle and to order another bottle and to keep on drinking. Well, you can't do that with 16-degree wine.
Well, you know, my son attempted to explain it to me at one point when I was really tearing my hair out, and he said, you know, you really don't get it, Pops. And I said, well, that's sort of an understatement there. But he said, people are buying this, with younger people in particular, you're buying this wine and drinking it in lieu of a cocktail. Well, if you think about it, the difference between a plain glass of 12.5% wine or a martini or a Manhattan or an old-fashioned, you're walking around drinking, talking, and you sort of like the idea of getting a little bit of a buzz. Well, if you have one of these high-alcohol wines, it's fruity and it smells pretty and it's easy to go down, and it gets you a little bit lit up more quickly. And it seems to me for that crowd, it seems to work. What troubles me is not being able to correlate it to being a companion to food, because I have yet to find any way I can make a meal that relates to that kind of food, to that kind of wine.
Famous winemaker dinner with the high alcohol Zinfandels. Winemaker looked out over his audience and said, "What food do you think this will go with?" Strangled voice from the back of the room, "Live game."
Hugh, what?
See, I think it's a fundamental misuse, the cocktail effort. Wine is one of the few things that you can taste that is this impression that it leaves in your mind, because that's where it goes first. It comes to your palate, second, it goes to your palate first, then it goes to your mind. And it can give a sense of completeness. It's one of the few beverages or foods that can give a sense of completeness. And what does it mean to have completeness? Three things are necessary. It has to have a beginning, it has to have a middle, and it has to have an end. And when you can experience that, it's pleasant. It's pleasant. Its pleasure is one because we are so incomplete ourselves that wine is one of the few things that can give us that thing with pleasure. And I think if you're using it as a cocktail, you're taking away that potential that wine has.
Probably couldn't say that to somebody that drinks martinis all the time, or Manhattans, could you?
Yeah, I don't think you can get a sense of completeness with a martini.
Okay. Hugh? Oh, I thought it looked like you were ready to jump into the fray.
I'll follow on anything, but you have the questions.
Okay. Well, what's the next step? What was the next step in the big, can we call it the watershed moment in the acceptance of California wine and the industry being accepted worldwide? What next steps took us to that level?
Well, there's still a problem with price. You know, the California prices are very, very high. And I regularly drink, well, Bordeaux as much as anything. And I can get a very satisfying, complete, beginning, middling, and ending Bordeaux for, let's say, $20 or less, in great variety, too. And that just simply isn't true in California, unfortunately. And if I go into a bottle store going up the Napa Valley, the sort of place tourists stop, it's hardly a Cabernet under $100. I can't believe it. I mean, what is this? How can people want to spend that much money when they can get this sort of pleasure at a fraction of that? I mean, that phrase, reassuringly expensive, I'm afraid, it sums up a lot of truth.
It's a painful reality. It's become more of a collector's item, or how about the ones that are $500 and $1,000 a bottle, and people are standing in line to get them. It's that the one thing that nobody else can get.
Exactly. Well, as I said, it used to be for the worthy, now it's for the wealthy.
Yeah, right. I think we're going to have time for some questions from the audience. Do we have microphones available, or how are we set up? So if someone has a question, if you'll raise your hand, here's the lady right in the front here.
Did I understand, therefore, if I open up a bottle of wine from, let's say, Napa Valley, Cab Sauvignon, earlier than 1966, that it is made with Californian oak?
Earlier than 1966?
Yes. Didn't you mention
Well,
it?
if it
1966?
was Hansel was using early in the 50s, they were using French oak. I don't think it was a large scale before that, 1966.
So before 19,
It may have been American oak, or it may have been no oak.
okay, thank you.
Or it may be large oak vessel.
And it would not likely have been California in any event.
Yeah, as a minor contribution, Beaulieu absolutely used American oak barrels. Inglenook used old Slovenian oak casks in the neighborhood of 1,000 gallons each. Krug used redwood, big old redwood tanks. They did not have any barrels. Old tanks get a liner of precipitated tartrate crystals, and they become, in effect, an enormous bottle after a certain age. So that was Krug. Leaving Martini, which had also old European oak, big ovals, and some redwood, and those two were mixed together.
Well,
And those were the four wines that you would ever be able to find as vintage dated, maybe older than last year's. There were a few others, but they were very sporadic in the market, very hard to find. So, short answer, that's the history as I remember it.
I think it's worth remarking on the flavor of oak, because oak has been used since time immemorial as a container, because wine needs a container. And the idea that it's the actual perfume, I mean, oak is very smelly stuff. If you're thinking going into a carpenter's shop, there's a very strong odor in the air. And if that is a virtue in wine, that was not recognized for a very long time. In fact, in Bordeaux, where they probably use more barrels than anywhere else, they used to buy Baltic oak, or they never used French oak because it smelled too strong. They didn't look for that as an additional fragrance in the wine. And when it was discovered, you know, I think that Zellerbach made the most extraordinary discovery. I mean, he wanted his wines to be like the Burgundy. He built his little winery to remind people of the Clos de Vougeot. And it dawned on him that if it smelled of oak, it would smell of France. And that, I think, was a very, very important moment.
Yes.
I've been drinking California wine since the early 60s, and it appeared when the 100-point range and a person I would call the P.T. Barnum of wine critics suddenly decided that everything had to taste like a great vintage Latour. High alcohol, high extract, high wood, and it just seemed to be a lack of comment about acidity and balance and freshness of the wines. It seemed that, well, I think most of the wineries, because at some point we had a glut of wines here in California until the consumer caught up. If you wanted to sell wine, you needed to make wines like that so you could get a 98-point rating and sell wines. If you talk to the wine shops, they didn't particularly like the critic, they didn't particularly like the ratings, but it sold wine. And if you're a winery owner and you needed to sell wine, you had to conform to that formula.
That's
And
all.
what is your question?
My question is it seems to have returned more to wines of the 60s now. They're more balanced, and I'm wondering what you people who are in the wine industry has caused this change.
Yeah, well, I think maybe that has something to do with that pendulum that I talked about.
Swinging back.
I hope it does.
Yes, question here in the front.
Yeah,
Here's a microphone.
a different kind of question about wine rating. Let's suppose there were 10 wine critics who were rating 10 wines that were good or very good at least. What would be the variation in the ratings among the 10 wine critics, for instance?
Well, Bob sort of touched on that concept, that idea earlier. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a lot like movie criticism. Some of them read each other's so that they know that they're safe. Maynard had a great expression, the error of central tendency. You wanted to narrow down so you didn't look like a total idiot. Well, the wine press and the movie critic press and all the rest of the critic press is guilty of the error of central tendency to some degree or another. But you still see one guy 96 and somebody else with a different axe to grind 87. The range is enormous.
It depends an awful lot on who the judges are as well. I was on a panel a couple of years ago with a young man who was really, really anxious to give high marks to a wine that was very fresh and young and delicate and light and pleasant, and I said it was certainly a nice, pleasant wine. But there was a wine in the same category that was a much richer wine that had a little bit of oak on it, that had substantial amount of balance and tannin, and a wine that was simply years away from its peak. And I thought that deserved a lot of consideration for the wine that it was going to become. It certainly wasn't as ready to drink today. Well, it seems like the idea of putting wine away and aging it and observing the difference that comes with it having aged those years, whether it's in a wine barrel or in a glass tank, it undergoes changes. And a lot of that is lost with the way wine is being marketed now. The high alcohol, high fruit ones are, wow, exciting. And then there's just this stuff that we used to call plonk in the old days that is perfectly acceptable because you could take it home and drink it and it was made last week. So it's a real conflict there.
You. On the point of scoring, the range of scores, you know my great friend and colleague Jancis Robinson, who's sat right here. She scores out a point out of 20, which is a conventional sort of London way of doing it. And I always tease her because there's a lot of hovering between 16 and 17. And she uses 16 and a half, that means she's scoring out of 40. And I say, I have to read very, very carefully what you're saying about this wine, because between 16 and 17, so many wines fit in there. It means you appreciate them, you're thinking about them, you can't quite make up your mind.
Oh, you've got somebody here in the middle?
You mentioned that California wines are very expensive. Would you say that wines in the U.S. are equally expensive, or are there differences throughout the country that you found?
Excellent question. How about the writers? Does anybody have much experience with wines outside of California, American wines?
Well, the Northwest, yes. I mean,
Okay.
it's a very similar picture.
All right?
Yeah, it isn't quite as exaggerated in the Northwest as it is here. There are still, if you're willing to be bold and brave, places to go. The two peninsulas in Michigan have turned out some very nice white wines, worth way more than the money they're asking. There's some in New York still that are priced in the high single figures.
In the high single figures,
Yes,
like
the
$8,
high
$9?
one, yeah, $9. You know, you can still, some of these other states, and they're quite delicious products.
Yeah, and I've been working a little bit with Colorado wines. I had something to do with bringing vinifera to Colorado, and they're beautiful wines, some of them, and they're very attractively priced, and maybe underpriced, I think. Their Cabernet Franc does exceedingly well. It doesn't have the green note that some of the California Sauvignon Blancs have, so I have lots of high praise for those wines, and I think you would be well, if you saw one on the market here, to look at it.
It should be noted that every one of the 50 states does produce wine commercially. It's kind of, people are shocked when they say, wait, Hawaii, Alaska? Yes. It's limited and it's not all over the state, but every single state does have commercial wineries. We have a microphone here.
We've been talking about Napa and Sonoma almost exclusively, and that's about 7% of the California production, in my own estimation.
What percent?
7 or 8%. And before 1976 particularly, the Central Valley of this country, which is still producing more than 90%, by the way, played a huge role. And they were very different from the European wines which we're trying to emulate now in this part of the world of California. And I wonder if and by the way, this university was almost entirely dedicated to wine production and grape growing of those areas, of the high production areas. I wonder if we shouldn't talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, and maybe, Augustine, I would wonder whether that 90%, because I have this book, which was a Bible for me. It's called Bulletin 794. It was an effort to identify the zones of California, and the kinds of wines that would be appropriate for each zone. And it began, strikingly, they began to gather data for this in 1944. The Second World War was not even over before they started putting together the baseline and the data points that they needed to identify the relevant characteristics in not only pH and sugar and accumulation of other things that would be a way of judging the wines. And they went all throughout the 5 zones that you mentioned. And they accumulate, and this eventually led to the Amorin-Winkler scale of the heat zones and the wines that were appropriate for each of those zones. So unfortunately, we've been talking about, from your point of view, we've been talking about only 2 of the zones, only 3 of the zones, really. When you get to 4, and the grapes that are appropriate for that would have been different grapes, and the grapes that were appropriate for zone 5, the hottest zone, which you're talking about, would be at another scale and produce another kind of wine to their best ability.
Hugh?
Well, I'm so glad that that point has come up, actually, because I would like to pay tribute to the Gallows and others who developed the most drinkable wines and really paid some close attention. They may have called them Chablis or something, but they were good. And I remember going to New York many, many years ago and trying a Grand Cru Chablis on a restaurant list at some impossible price. And it was not in good shape because wines in those days were not very often shipped in reefers where they used to boil coming over the Atlantic. And I compared it with a Gallo Chablis Blanc that they had on the list. And my goodness, the California wine was infinitely the better of the two. So I used to say to people, don't think it's got to be imported. There's really good stuff made in very large quantities. And that is still true, but I'm very glad that that point came up.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one line, though. The way those wines had to be marketed in their time caused the producers to try to escape notice from wine writers. They were extremely well-made commodity products. They did not want attention called to themselves from anybody who wanted to talk about differences. They wanted their customers to trust the beverage in the bottle to the ultimate degree. And they succeeded in that, and to their credit, but it also kept anybody from talking about them in newspapers.
My first trip to Europe was in 1966. We had a Eurail pass for a month, so we could get on a train and get off anywhere it went. And I was determined to taste the house wine everywhere we went. So as soon as we sat down, I ordered a bottle of the house red. And every single time, I had to reject it and ask for the wine list. Sometimes it was just barely able to get past the smell. And walking the streets in the early morning hours, when the empty barrels had been put out to be picked up by the vendor, I stuck my nose in those barrels, and it was just obvious that this stuff was not being treated like anything other than a commodity. It was just, you know, it's something you had instead of drinking water. I came home claiming that Gallo Hardy Burgundy was better than any house wine I had in France or Italy on that trip. I mean, it was just no question. The way it was made, the quality of the wine was just dramatically and profoundly better. And with the modern techniques of winemaking plugging in and identifying these zones more particularly, in the early time zone things, we thought anything south of the Bay Area was made for either Planck or dessert wines. But look at these areas in the Central Coast where a little bit of an ocean breeze comes in and suddenly there's a whole little valley there that's producing superb wine. The river valleys that empty into the bay around Lodi and around that area, we find more and more interesting wines that in the past had just been considered part of the jug wines. All of that has made a profound difference and a profound change.
Can I just
please
dive back a little further, a lot further in California wine history, because I just happened to be in a restaurant in San Francisco the other day, which has its historic wine list on the very simple wine list up on the wall. And I think the date was about 1910. Mm-hmm. And there were two categories of wine. There was sweet wine, and then it said it includes port, sherry, muscat, Tokai, something like that, 15 cents a glass. Mm-hmm. Dry wine, Sauterne, Chablis, Claret, Burgundy, 10 cents a glass.
Yes, in the Senate.
Yes, Europe has centuries on us in terms of deciding what grows best where. And we just started as in 1944. I'd like you to imagine yourselves or coming back to California wines in particular, and 300, 400 years from now, how do you think Americans will, the American wine industry will evolve? Will we get as specific as, you know, a little crew in Burgundy, you know, kind of thing, or will we be more free form? Just imagine.
Well, I'd like to add to that question because it was one of my wrap-up questions was, how about the next decade or two? 300 or 400 years might be pushing it a little too far, but how in the immediate future, let's talk about where you think things are going. Look, I'd like to hear from all three of you. Warren.
Yeah, well, I think that's very good, a very good question. I think in an area like Monterey County, Santa Rita Hills, you will find this kind of differentiation. They will be going the way of Burgundy. It's getting, the distinctiveness is getting more and more defined. So I think in that particular place, that will be a definite direction to go.
And we're trying to avoid mentioning anything about climate change, but it's interesting that in the Rhine River they're growing Pinot Noir. There was an ad 2 or 3 years ago. A developer bought a huge tract of land in Sweden, and he was promoting the ideal place to grow Cabernet Sauvignon in 20 years, based on his projection of the changing temperature. Bob, you want to continue with your thoughts about the future?
Well, 300 years, I think we have to worry about population growth and water. So that's way past my use-by date. On a shorter term, I suspect that there is going to be somewhere a little bit of a turn back to science, to looking at details, to wanting to make the small differences, and I really hope it's in the next 10, 15 years. I think that Warren's pendulum is gathering a little momentum in the direction of not doing the most that you can do, whatever that is. You know, it's really interesting. Hugh has the long history with both continents, watched them very carefully, and the central difference so far is that Europe has had to wait with bated breath to get sugar in the grapes in most seasons. And Californians have had the reverse problem of trying to decide how long they can afford to wait before there's too much. and that imbalance is what made it easy for this explosive kind of wine to have this sudden flourishing. But I hope humankind is going to get tired of the hangovers.
Hugh.
Well, I think looking for cooler places to go due to climate change is not just a California thing to happen, going further up the Sonoma coast and all that. But just anecdotally, I wrote to a very good friend, Miguel Torres, who make the most excellent wines in Catalonia, and made the first fine Spanish Cabernet, very, very fine wine. And I wrote to him worrying about the political situation between Barcelona and Madrid, saying, how's this going to affect you? He said, that's not my worry. My worry is finding cooler places to grow grapes, going up into the Pyrenees.
Question right in the front here.
When I remember back to the mid-'60s to the early '70s, Paul Masson, Almaden, and you mentioned Gallo, and boy, if you wanted a premium wine, you'd go get Matisse or something like that. And so what was the entrepreneurial spirit like for making fine wine? When was it? If we make it, they will come. Was there a sense of confidence that if we make fine wine, the market will develop?
Warren, I guess we're going to have to start with you, since you were making wine.
I don't think it was entrepreneurial. In the folks I knew who were coming into the Napa Valley, to take only that example, they were people who were seeking to articulate something in themselves, and wine suggested some wine experience, some epiphany, if you will, about a particular, this particular beverage was like a human being. It spoke to them and said, you should do this. You should get involved with this special, it's not a beverage. You're not experiencing a beverage, you're experiencing something else. And they followed that. And that they could live from it, they were interested in that, of course. I speak for myself. But that wasn't the main, and I don't think it was for Jack Davies either and his family when they came there to resurrect an old winery on the hillside. That group of people came because they loved wine.
Yeah. Bob? Yeah, I just echo that. All the people I know knew, in some cases, who came in that era, money mattered. They wanted to eat, but it was not primary. A lot of them were second careers. Jack Davies had been very successful with Ducommun Corporation in terms of money, but it didn't satisfy him. He didn't enjoy the work. And he had stumbled into wine. Some friends of his had dragged him into a partnership in Martin Ray. And anybody who could survive a partnership with Martin really had to love the subject. He was a hard taskmaster. But there were probably 20 or 30 people who came in to wine in that era as second careers, mature people. They were not youngsters. They weren't family inheritors. They were people who had discovered the beverage and loved it and wanted to go there and do that.
Hugh, yes,
well,
no?
I think we should also remember the interpreters of wine, the wine writers, actually, and the critics and the importers. Because you mentioned Almaden, one character sprang into my mind, and that was a writer and importer called Frank Schoonmaker, who I was lucky enough to know. And there was also Alexis Lichine, talking about the 1950s, really. These were guys who'd been in Europe in the war as journalists, I think, and they came back with an idea of wine that was quite different. It was Frank Schoonmaker who first suggested to Almaden that they should describe what a grape variety was on the back label. And so Cabernet Sauvignon was the grape, the grape of the great red Bordeaux, and Chardonnay was the grape of the great white Burgundies. So there was that earlier stage as well of interpretation, which all added up to the wonderful things that have happened since.
I think we have a question right here.
Yes, thank you for sharing your memories of California wine. Listening to your conversation earlier, I had a thought that, and I think all of you suggested that the varietal and the vintage of the wine itself had a relationship with the variety and the vintage of the taste buds of that, the tongue that was tasting that wine. Do you ever worry about the remembrance of wines past? How reliable is our memory of that kind of taste? I mean, I'm a historian, so I was just thinking that, is it possible to archive a mouthfeel? But clearly the function of writing is absolutely invaluable for that. And I thought if you had any thoughts on this.
Wow, there's a good I guess I'd like to throw in a little comment in that regard. Vintages vary, of course, constantly, and I'm sure that we could ask the four of us and you'll get 4 different answers. But for me, the Napa Valley Cabernets for the last century were 36, 51, 58, and 74. And I have some pretty fond memories of the 74s. And in all instances, there were great wines immediately preceding and immediately following. I mean, after all, it was the 73 that beat the French in the Judgment of Paris. But how do you remember them? How well do we remember them may be a different story. But emotionally and sort of down in my gut, I have memories associated with specific wines. Hugh?
69, you left that out.
Well, as I said, we
oh, it's the where and the when and the people and all that as well. It's,
all,
you know,
all ties in.
The wine in the glass is part of the whole of a wider scene, and you cannot separate one from the other.
Bob?
Can't say it any better. It's you have to have a good memory if you're going to write. Good notes really help, but human sense of smell is one of the most profound, and there are flickers that hang on for years and years and years, but they also keep getting better.
Warren, last word.
And there's the pleasure of that recollection, remembering that pleasant and satisfying aroma, and you don't want to part with it. And so you keep it in a safe place, or some parts of you does that for you, and you come back to it as a fulfilling and satisfying experience.
Wonderful.
Sorry.
Well, that pretty much wraps it up for us. I see the students have a bunch of empty glasses there that are about to be filled with wine. So
Yes.
I'm going to come back to Mackenzie and see where we go.
Thank you. I can't imagine a better way to end this wonderful evening. And please, all of you, join me in thanking this wonderful panel.